So I presented a bit of a graphic on what does athlete well-being look like, and kind of like this quick guide to what does the component mean and what are some protective factors that we could potentially work on with athletes. So the first component was self-confidence and worth, and I'm numbering them, but they're not in any order. So that component is self-confidence and sport worth. So athletes have to manage a lot of expectations, and oftentimes their external expectations. So from coaches, organizations, funding agencies, so forth. Um, and they're often contingent on performance. So athletes then could get in a position where they're basing their worth off of what other people are dictating or saying. And so what we were talking to athletes about is having this self-referenced self-confidence and sport worth. So having kind of it coming from internal or the inside. And protective factors could be having that self-reference, trusting in your abilities, trusting in the process. So you're going through all this training, you're working with people that are experienced, that work within the sport, and then having well-being based internally. So you're basing your own well-being. You're not letting others base your well-being. Yeah. And so that was kind of the first point. And the second area, the second dimension was having a personal balance. So athletes like to be 100% invested in sport because they're expected to put their life into it. They want to perform. So the prevailing belief is that if you don't spend 100% of your time on this, then you're missing an opportunity. But actually talking to athletes, getting perspectives, and I think it shifted based on where the athlete was at in their career, what they had already accomplished. That the balance is unique to each person. Athletes did agree that some people need more of a balance, some people need less of a balance. They also agreed that there's this ebb and flow nature. So maybe we're in a really, it's kind of, one athlete kind of talked about it almost being like her training program. There's periods with high intensity where you're all invested, but there's also periods where you taper off. So managing that balance, but doing it in a way that worked for you. I think as practitioners working with athletes, you want to say, you need this balance, you need other areas of your life, you need to go do this. But it has to come from the athlete. So it has to be athlete directed because otherwise it can cause this greater stress, this greater anxiety, and then all of a sudden athletes aren't feeling well.
That feels like as you mentioned, maybe a point of maturity for somebody to have the wherewithal, experience, and trust the process to stop and say, training more at the moment or intensifying my focus on that split and that time or that conversion rate is not helping me. And so they get their heads up or they seek outside support or pursuing something else. That means then that they're refreshing or they're recovering and they come back more effective. I wouldn't say necessarily age, because I've met young athletes with a very mature perspective on that, but they've been through an experience that's helped them understand the importance of balance.
I was going to say, I think it comes down to the experience. And sometimes some athletes said that, people can tell me, and this is maybe more trusting in the process and focusing on that versus the outcome. But it kind of spread over a few dimensions, and it was, people can tell me it, but I almost needed to experience it to really believe it. And to be able to then shift and trust that. But it is interesting because, an athlete spoke about, I just wanted to be in sport all the time. I believe that would lead me to success. And then I realized after the Olympic Games that it wasn't the case, that I actually needed to take a little bit of time away or balance that training a little bit, and then I would perform better. But
Yeah,
it's not the
interesting.
narrative that we always hear.
It seems as though so many of these will be interlinked or
Mm-hmm.
supportive for each other.
Yeah.
I heard in that example there,
Mm-hmm.
self-worth, that
Yeah.
if I attach everything that I'm experiencing and attach my self-worth to the results I'm getting, that's not healthy. Therefore, I need other things in my life.
Yeah. I think a lot of the dimensions, because we're in a performance-oriented context, are related to performance. I can jump ahead because performance is one of the components, and I struggled
Okay.
on whether or not, is this a component or is it just the environment, right?
Yeah,
Because
it's just
everything, and I say within the research that everything is shaped by performance. We're not getting rid of it. And so I think the way that I'm kind of thinking about performance here is almost a sense of accomplishment. So it's not just winning and losing, but it is this sort of progression,
okay.
accomplishment, because I think it has to be more than winning and losing, but everything is shaped by performance. So within that component, we talk about how we're in a performance environment, right? There's expected behaviors. You're expected to win at all costs. And like you said earlier within this conversation, athletes are expected to push through. That's not always the greatest action to, promote, protect, support their well-being, but that's what you're supposed to do. That's what high performance sport is supposed to look like. But it could come at a cost, and maybe again it comes with a limited timestamp. You can only do that for so long. So I
Mm,
think it's talking to athletes, and again, I don't think you can push this on athletes, but it's outcome versus process. It's, yes, we want to pursue excellence, and I think that's something that we could all agree on. But pursuing excellence as a process doesn't mean that we're sacrificing, excellence as a result. But it's, how do
love
we
that.
get there? How do we work there? It's, it's easier said than done at sometimes. And I think I can look back on even, I wasn't an elite athlete, but there's times where I felt like I just need to focus on the results. So I think it's easier said than done. But I think with experience, with conversation shifting, with, how do we do this? How do we make sure that we are still striving for excellence? That there can be a little bit of a head turn. And that's where athletes said that, I know that it might be better for me, but it takes a lot of trust. And I fear that if I do that, I might not be getting the outcome. But we don't have data to say that it hinders outcome. We actually have stuff to say that, it's probably better,
Yeah.
right? But
There's a
it's,
heartiness to it that and the quote that I recall is from James Cracknell on the podcast, multiple Olympic champion, and he said we wanted to be world class at the things that require no talent, and so that process, but also the pursuit of excellence, is going to be part of our enriched journey, irrespective of whether the results go our way. That's going to be part of us and how we do things. Like you
yeah,
say, that requires standards. It requires tough conversations.
yeah.
It requires maintaining that intensity.
Well, it requires self-acceptance as an athlete too. You're not always going to be perfect, and that's something that athletes struggle with, right? And there's a lot to it. Yeah, I spoke with some athletes that had experienced that shift in perspective over their career, and how they were in such a better place. And these athletes, and I think it kind of gets me thinking too about that maturity and experiences, but that had experienced multiple Olympic or Paralympic games. And they got to a point where they said, I can focus on that process. I am content with where I'm at. If I have given it my all, if I have done my best, then I'm happy. And I imagine that is a really, really hard place to get to as an athlete. And it's not that you're accepting that you're not going to win or you're not going to be great, but that you're satisfied with what you've done. Which I think, even if you kind of shift the context in your business life or in different areas, how do you get to that point where you are satisfied with, maybe not being the best, but doing the best that you can do? Yeah. So I thought it was really interesting.
I'm a student of athlete interviews post performance, post final. I say student. I'm just engaged. No, I don't need a filter. Then I'm absolutely dialed in. And I thought, for the first time, this is anecdotal and purely my subjective observation, I thought the Olympics last in Paris had a much stronger emphasis of I'm pleased. I'm pleased with the way I did things on my terms. I'm satisfied. And I thought there was a real mix of responses like that for winners and second, third, fourths. I thought it was a real trend moving towards that.
Yeah, we see some of the narratives with like sporting organizations, national sporting organizations, changing a little bit too, where it's like, win well, or, I think it was like pursuit of excellence. So we're looking at some terminology changing, maybe with a recognition that if you are well, it can be just as beneficial, or it can be, So
although I've heard counter to win well to some people has sounded additive. We want you to win, and we want you to do it well.
not just supportive.
not perform well, as in perform in a way that you're proud. I think that's different. There was a real focus on being role models in Australia as a pursuit. That's the goal. Whereas win well, I've heard being misinterpreted as an idea.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Go on, now, give us some more.
So we have aligned purpose. So I think that it was important that, we see purpose as a fundamental concept of eudaemonia, but I think having that aligned purpose where you're doing, because I guess I'll back up again, but athletes are in this environment where they often forgo a lot of their power, right? They put themselves in an environment where then other people are kind of in control. And we don't often see that in many other contexts. So I think it's important that athletes' actions, their values, their beliefs align to their purpose. So why are they participating in sport? Why are you doing this? What you're going through, what you're doing, does this align? Does it contribute to your sense of purpose in sport? So having that kind of like those goals that align with your beliefs and continually working toward that. And then I think that's very closely intertwined with feelings of fulfillment. So again, another kind of fundamental concept of eudaemonia, right? That deeper sense of motivation. So I know I define it as almost this deep joy and happiness for participating, and not necessarily pleasurable, but this deep sense of meaning. So you're getting up every day, you're doing this because you love it, right? So it gives you this sense of fulfillment. So it's satisfying your needs, and it's meeting kind of your personal priorities in sport. Are you doing this? Is this individual? Is it relational? Are you doing it for a sense of agency? Are you advocating? It's aligning with what you really believe in. So those are a couple that were really, I think, probably fundamental to kind of conceptualizations of eudaemonia.
Could I ask you about one of the bullet points on your paper?
Yeah.
One word under purpose was harmony and coherence. Could you just clarify that? Because I think sometimes elite performance is not harmonious. It's disruptive, it's complex, it's uncertain.
Right.
And so there's not a sense of cruising here.
Right.
What's the...
Right.
Does it speak more to it's harmonious with me? It's aligned with my thoughts.
Yes, so I'm talking more about the alignment of your purpose. So there's this harmony in the sense that kind of this is all interconnected, it's contributing to one another. But I think when we shift from that, it's not that. I think we shift to maybe another component that looks at psychological adaptability. And so we know that you're in this high pressure environment that is constantly changing, that is throwing you curveballs that you constantly have to adapt to. So I think that the harmony is the sense of like, I'm doing what I want to do. I'm here for the right reasons. My needs are being met. My values are aligned. So I don't think it's necessarily the environment, like the stimulus or the responses that you have within the environment, but there's kind of things in the background that are working together.
So you've mentioned psychological adaptability. Is that covered, or does that need further just clarification?
Well, I think that coping in sport, we talk about, especially working with athletes, is a big component, right? We need to have this coping repertoire. And athletes are often faced with a lot of unforeseen challenges. So I think that athletes need to be able to adapt. So that's an important part. It's important psychological skills that athletes learn. Just being able to manage that uncertainty, to reappraise events. It's like, this might not be the end of the world. What can I do now? And then I think the important dimension here, the important kind of caveat is that all these experiences then you kind of have in your back pocket. They contribute to being able to further deal with different high pressure situations. You also grow as an athlete from that, right? There's kind of like this sense of resilience and growth and being able to deal with more that's thrown at you. So maybe as a beginning athlete or a young athlete, you go to your first Olympic Games and it's absolutely terrifying. But then you enter the second one, you have more of an idea what's going on. You know how to manage the nerves around it. You know how to, like that sort of thing. But I think the growth element is kind of the interesting caveat there. And then I think I have two left. So I had a component around personal agency. So within a lot of the Eudaemonic models, we see autonomy as an important component. But I wasn't convinced that athletes have full autonomy in sport, right? We're often, like I said earlier, we give up a lot of control. Coaches have a strong presence in, what we do, the structure, the routine. It's coming from a lot of different people. But I think that it was important to the athletes talked about that they had a say. There was this active role. They weren't just passive in saying, you have to do this, you have to do that, and you don't get a say in any of it. But I think that it's important that athletes have a say. Yes, I think there needs to be expertise, and there needs to be, I don't want to say some sort of control, but there needs to be some sort of direction from those that potentially, coaches and organizations and so forth. But athletes need to have a say. They need to be able to feel comfortable to speak up and have their needs met. Hey, this is not working for me. And I think about some of the Paralympic athletes that I spoke to, and it's like they were commenting on that disability is very individual, right? Not everyone's going to experience it the same. So maybe the training wasn't potentially working for them, but they didn't feel like they were in an environment that they could speak up and say, hey, I actually can't do another run. I actually can't do this because then I'm not going to be able to train tomorrow. So having a little bit of a kind of that two-way relationship.
Okay. So it's not personal agency in its fullest form as a pioneer. I'm going to go and do this. I'm
Yeah.
going to do what the hell I want.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about engagement and the permission to be able to stop, pause, go, continue as needs be. And that is difficult, isn't it? As you say, because it's you lock into a program and there's expectations of commitment, training, the amount of training that you do. You can't just rip it up and make it up. You've got to do what's required. But that sense of I have a voice, that feels quite important, that you'd come away from your training session thinking that you've shaped tomorrow.
And also that, you're cared about as a human being beyond an athlete, right? Like your input is valuable, right? We're working together to reach this optimal functioning. So yeah, I think there's importance there in having ability to have kind of a say. And then
that leads nicely into the final one, really, doesn't
into
it?
the last one, which is psychologically safe relationships. So we see within other eudaemonic models kind of like meaningful relationships or positive relationships, but I think within sport, where again athletes forgo that control, there's a hierarchy in kind of power relationships. We're asking athletes to do a lot. Performance is important. Having those inclusive and safe environments, so having those psychologically safe environments for athletes, because they are pushing themselves to the limits. And I think one of the biggest things that came up for athletes was that they felt scared to, like, it was fear-based. They felt fearful to push their limits, because if they didn't succeed, and this is even in practices and in training, if they didn't have a desirable outcome, they were fearful of the consequences. And so that kind of leads to that, I kind of had there's almost conditional support sometimes. It's like, if an athlete succeeds, okay, we support you. If an athlete doesn't succeed, as in, win or whatever, we don't. So I think having that unconditional support to promote the development, the further pushing of boundaries for an athlete is really important, especially if you want them to try to take those steps. So I don't think it's just positive relationships or meaningful relationships, but I think they need to be psychologically safe.